You're at a family dinner. Sisters are leaning across the table, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at a joke that doesn't need explaining because they were both there. There's an unspoken language happening between them that you were never issued. And then there's you. You're smiling, you're present, but you're observing. You noticed the exact second the tension shifted in the room, a detail everyone else missed. You aren't lonely. You're calibrated differently. The only girl in a Gen X house didn't get a built-in mirror. She got the adults. That quiet house and those grown-up conversations built a specific psychological blueprint that most people don't have a name for. Today, we're giving it that name, because the lone wolf traits you carry now aren't personality flaws. They are the architecture of a mind that learned to be its own company. Now, let's look at what that house actually did to you. Let's start with what people assumed about you. Spoiled, selfish, a little strange. That reputation has been following only children around since 1896, when a psychologist named G. Stanley Hall, the first president of the American Psychological Association, looked at a small group of children and decided the whole category was broken. He called being an only child a disease in itself. That was his actual phrase. And somehow it stuck. It stuck through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. By the time you were growing up, the assumption was already built into the culture your family was somehow incomplete. Something was missing. In 1976, only 11% of American mothers who had finished having children had just one kid. 4 out of 10 had 4 or more. So when you walked into school on Monday morning, almost every other kid had a sibling at home. Someone who understood what their parents were like behind closed doors without needing to be told. You didn't have that, and you knew it, even if nobody said it directly. Here's what's strange, though. The research never backed any of it up. A study of more than 20,000 adults measured 6 major personality traits and compared only children to people who grew up with siblings. The differences were so small that the researchers described them as vanishingly small. That was the word they chose, vanishingly. Decades of follow-up research confirmed the same thing. The stereotypes about only children being selfish or maladjusted never held up under scrutiny. They just never got corrected loudly enough to undo 100 years of assumption. But here's what research can't fully capture what your house actually felt like. The statistics tell you the stereotypes were wrong. They don't tell you what it was like to be the only kid at a table full of adults, absorbing everything, with nowhere else to look. That's where the real psychology begins. More than 90 of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. If you're starting to realize that your lone wolf nature isn't a personality flaw, but a survival skill you built to navigate a house full of adults, you belong here. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, share this with one person who needs to hear this. Now let's continue. There's a term psychologists use called adultification. The simple version is this: you were a short adult. Not because your parents were cruel, not because they made a conscious decision to pull you into their world, but because there was nobody else in the house, and adult conversation fills whatever space is available. So it filled yours. Dinner wasn't between kids in your house. It was between you and the grown-ups, which meant you heard things most children your age wouldn't encounter for another 10 years. Bills, work stress, what was really going on between your parents, the tension underneath a conversation that sounded normal on the surface, but wasn't. You weren't eavesdropping. You were right there, at the table, because there was no other table to be at. Think about what that actually means for a 10-year-old girl. A lot of you became your mother's confidant before you were old enough to fully understand what you were holding. Not because your mother was a bad parent, she wasn't, but because the Gen X era didn't have a roadmap for raising one child without accidentally pulling her into adult emotional space. There was no guidebook. There was just the two of you, and the distance between mom and daughter and the 2 women in this house got shorter than it should have. And here's what that built in you, specifically as a girl. What a lot of people call female intuition. That thing where you walk into a room and immediately know something is off. where you can hear what someone isn't saying, that didn't arrive as a gift. It got built, slowly, through years of being the only person in the room paying close attention. You noticed when your mother's voice changed mid-phone call. You could tell your father was upset before he said a single word, not because you were especially perceptive by nature, but because there was nothing else to distract you and nobody else to share the noticing with. You became finely tuned to other people's emotional states because your environment required it. The era matters here, and it's worth saying clearly this isn't about blaming your parents. Gen X parents were navigating real instability, economic pressure that hit hard in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, divorce rates that had doubled in a single generation, cultural shifts that left a lot of families without a script. Your parents were figuring it out in real time, and their only daughter was sitting right there, absorbing all of it, without a sibling to turn to afterward, without anyone to split the emotional weight with. You carried what they were going through, quietly and completely, because that's what the situation asked of you. What that did to your nervous system, your sense of responsibility, the way you read people before they've finished a sentence, that's not random. That's years of training in a very specific emotional environment. And that emotional load didn't just shape how you feel, it shaped how you think, how you create, and what you do with time when you're finally completely alone. Saturday afternoon. No internet. No group chat to check. No guarantee that if you knocked on a neighbor's door, anyone would answer. If you wanted something to happen, you had to build it yourself out of whatever the house had, whatever your mind could produce, whatever the afternoon was willing to give you. That was the baseline of your childhood, and it did something to your brain that researchers are only now starting to measure properly. Psychologist Eileen Kennedy Moore found that only children were more likely to create imaginary companions than kids with siblings. Not because they were lonely in some tragic sense, but because they had two things most children didn't: unstructured time and the mental space to invent. When there's no sibling to follow around, no built-in social structure to slot yourself into, your imagination has to do more of the work. So it does, and it gets very, very good at it. A lot of you had entire worlds running in your head. Not just daydreams, actual systems. Forts with governments and rules. Bike rides narrated like you were the main character in a film nobody else could see. A backyard that became a forest, a kingdom, a crime scene, a runway, depending on what the day required. You weren't wasting time. You were building cognitive infrastructure. Research on only children found they score higher on cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between different concepts, hold multiple ideas at once, and approach problems from angles other people don't consider. What's striking is that those differences don't just show up on personality tests. They show up in actual brain structure. The solitude literally shaped how your brain developed. The hours you spent alone, making things up, weren't empty. They were formative in the most physical sense of that word. That internal world didn't disappear when you grew up. You probably still do it, running through scenarios before they happen, thinking in stories, processing experiences like you're narrating them from the outside. That's not a quirk. That's the architecture of a mind that learned to be its own company. But there's another side to all of that solitude, and it's worth saying plainly. When your parents argued, you were the only audience. There was no sibling to catch your eye across the room. Nobody to find afterward and whisper, "Did you hear that? Was that bad? Is that normal?" You couldn't compare notes. You couldn't split the weight of what you just witnessed with someone who was also inside it. So you absorbed it, filed it, formed your own interpretation of what was happening in your family, and then lived with that interpretation alone, hoping you'd read it right. That's not a small thing for a child to carry. And for a girl, specifically already being socialized to manage emotions, to keep the peace, to stay attuned, that weight landed differently than it might have for a boy in the same house. What grew out of that experience is a habit that most people with siblings never fully develop, the ability to process the world entirely inside your own head. You don't need to talk something through to understand it. You sit with it, turn it over, examine it from every angle, and come to your own conclusions. You always have. That habit is running in you right now. It shapes how you handle conflict, how you make decisions, how long you can go without talking to anyone and still feel completely fine. It's so automatic, you probably don't notice it as a skill anymore. But here's the thing about habits that form in childhood under pressure. They don't stay neutral. They evolve into patterns. And the pattern that came out of all that solitude and emotional weight is probably the one that's most visible in your adult life right now. When you're the only child, you're the entire investment. There's no backup kid to absorb some of the expectation, no siblings' good grades to soften the blow of yours, no other story your parents can tell at the holiday table if yours doesn't go well. Every hope they had for a child landed on you, specifically, completely, with nowhere else to go. That's not blame. That's just the math of a one-child house in an era that hadn't figured out what to do with it yet. The 1970s and 1980s didn't have a parenting manual for raising an only daughter without accidentally turning her into a project. So some of you became the girl who had to get the A, win the recital, stay out of trouble, not because your parents were unreasonable people, but because the pressure of undivided attention is its own kind of weight, even when it comes from love. Think about the woman you probably are at work right now. There's a massive project on her desk. It's too much for one person, and she knows it. But she's not asking for help. She'll stay late, restructure the whole thing, quietly absorb the extra hours because asking for help was never the default setting. She's got it became her identity so early, she stopped noticing it was a choice. Or think about the woman who cannot afford to fail. Not emotionally, because she understands that she is her parents' only plan, their one legacy. When the time comes, and for a lot of Gen X only daughters, that time is now, or close, there's no sibling to split the phone calls with, no one else to handle the finances while you handle the visits. It all lands on one set of shoulders, yours. And you'll carry it, because that's what you do. Psychologists call it hyperindependence. The simple version, the habit of never asking for help. It made sense when you were 8 and the house was quiet and figuring things out yourself was just survival. But a survival mechanism that runs unchecked in adulthood becomes a cage. The woman who never needs anyone eventually finds that people stop offering, not because they don't care, but because she's never once let them in. Here's the one thing I want you to actually use from this video. When an aging parent or a demanding boss pulls on that "I can handle everything" identity, the answer isn't to handle more. Try this instead. I'll look into what support is available for this. That's it. You're not saying no. You're not failing anyone. You're just refusing to automatically absorb a load that was never meant to be carried by one person alone. Solitude is a superpower. Total self-reliance is a different thing. And knowing the difference is what the next section is really about. Growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, every family on television had multiple kids. The Brady Bunch, Family Ties, Growing Pains. Even the cereal commercials ran on sibling dynamics. 2 kids arguing over the last bowl, brothers sharing a bedroom, sisters whispering about boys at the kitchen table. Your version of childhood wasn't on any screen. There was no show about the girl who spent Saturday afternoon building an entire world by herself because nobody was coming over. When something is invisible in the culture, you start to wonder, quietly, if it counts. A lot of only daughters carried that "am I enough" question longer than they should have. But what that invisibility actually produced is something most people never develop at all. A relationship with your own thoughts that runs deeper than almost anything a sibling-filled house could have built. You are the woman in the room who speaks last and says the most, because you've already worked through 5 versions of an idea before your mouth opens. Researchers who reviewed the data put it plainly. The greatest gift of being an only child is learning to be content with your own company, because your primary relationship in life is with yourself. That's not a consolation prize. Some people chase that their whole lives and never find it. You were never too sensitive or a strange child. You were a small observer building a massive internal world because the external one was too heavy to carry alone. More than 50 of people have already clicked away by now. If you're still here, it's because you have the rare ability to look at your own patterns without blinking. That usually means you've finally found a piece of the truth about why you are the way you are. And the next video is where we look at the one specific trait you developed that people still mistake for a weakness.